All right, we're going to go ahead and get the webinar started now. Thanks to everyone for joining us here today. And welcome to this webinar hosted by Columbia Riverkeeper entitled, What's the Deal with New Nuclear? My name is Kelly Campbell. I'm the Policy Director here at Columbia Riverkeeper, and I use she, her pronouns, and I will be the moderator for this discussion today. And I'm really excited to dig into this important topic with our fantastic panel of speakers, Leona Morgan, MV Ramana, and Joshua Frank. So I'd like to start this webinar by grounding us in an acknowledgement of the land. Here at Columbia Riverkeeper, we recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Native people and their traditional territories. I'm joining today from Portland, Oregon, which sits on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Claflamet, and Clackamas bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes that made their home along the Columbia River. Today, many descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, as well as the Chinook Nation and the Cowlitz Nation. These tribes have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial, and they continue to do so in the present day. If you don't know whose land you're on, please take the time to learn it. Columbia Riverkeeper's mission is to protect and restore the water quality of the Columbia River and all life connected to it, from the headwaters to the Pacific Ocean. One of our key program areas addresses the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, the most contaminated nuclear cleanup site in the Western Hemisphere, which lies on the banks of the Columbia River. We work in solidarity with the Yakima Nation and other tribes to hold the US government accountable for protecting people and the river from Hanford's radioactive and toxic legacy. It's due to our deeply rooted work on Hanford cleanup that we oppose plans to build new nuclear power at Hanford or anywhere along the Columbia River. This work connects us to partners outside the Columbia River Basin that are also confronting the threats of uranium mining, nuclear power, and nuclear waste in their communities. And I know we've got folks from all over the US today, as well as participants from South Africa. So welcome wherever you are to our webinar today. Well, this topic is even more timely than I thought it was going to be when we started organizing the event a couple months ago. So in the past year, Oregon-based NuScale, which was expected to be the first company to actually build a small modular nuclear reactor in the US, their project fell apart after it had doubled in cost and was 7 years behind schedule. And now NuScale is being sued by its investors. Just this August, the Umatilla County, Oregon Board of Supervisors voted to hire paid lobbyists to try to overturn Oregon's longstanding moratorium on nuclear power at the legislature. And in the past week or so, Amazon Web Services has announced a new partnership with Energy Northwest to attempt to build X Energy's small modular nuclear reactors at the Hanford cleanup site on the Columbia River in Washington. Microsoft and Google have also just announced plans around new nuclear and attempting to revive old nuclear plants. And the Department of Energy just announced a $900 million in funds to support small modular nuclear reactors. So there's a lot of new announcements in our region and elsewhere, and there's a lot of hype out there about these new plans. So we have plenty to talk about. And luckily, we have a fantastic panel here to be part of the conversation today. So as far as the format, I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists and then get the conversation started by posing some of the questions that you all have already sent into our panel. If you have questions that come up during the discussion, please use the Q&A function and we'll take those questions later in the hour as we have time. If you're a member of the press with a question, please identify as such in your written question. We won't be using the chat function today, but we will send everyone a follow-up email with any resources that are mentioned by panelists during the webinar, as well as a link to the recording. So on to our panelist introductions. I'll start with Leona Morgan. Leona, she, her, is a Diné Indigenous organizer who's been fighting to stop nuclear colonialism since 2007. Leona is a co-founder of Haul No, that's H-A-U-L, no, exclamation point, an initiative to stop the Energy Fuels Pinyon Plain uranium mine near the Grand Canyon and related transport between the mine and the White Mesa uranium mill. Leona collaborates with affected communities in the Southwest, nationally and internationally on issues across the uranium fuel chain. Leona is a graduate student pursuing a Master's of Community and Regional Planning, focusing on Indigenous planning, at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I've been a fan of Leona's for many years from afar, and so it's super great to get to work with her on this webinar. Next, I'd like to introduce MV Ramana. He's the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and a professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. He is the author of the new book, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. He's also written The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, and he was the co-editor of Prisoners of the Nuclear Dream. He is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials and the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, the Canadian Pugwash Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He's also a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Leo Szilard Award from the American Physical Society. Welcome, Ramana. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And our third panelist is Joshua Frank, him. He's an award-winning environmental journalist and managing editorial director of Counterpunch. Most recently, he's the author of Atomic Days, the untold story of the most toxic place in America, and also the co-author of The Big Heat, Earth on the Brink. He's currently wrapping up a new book on the impacts of the world's energy transition for Haymarket Books. And if you want to see more with Ramana, or excuse me, with Joshua, you can look at the Columbia Riverkeeper YouTube page. We had a whole hour session talking with him about his new book a few months ago. So I want to thank all three panelists for being here today. And we'll get started with some of the discussion questions. So just to start us off, we had several questions about your elevator pitch, or how would you share your perspective on why nuclear power is not a climate solution with friends, family, and others in a succinct and compelling way. Ramana, since this is basically the title of your book, I'm going to ask you to start first.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's a real honor to be on a panel with Joshua and Leona, and to have all these people take some time from their day to join us. I'm joining from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people who have called this area home for thousands and thousands of years, and I'm privileged to be living here. Thank you for your question. I'll be very brief because I know we have a lot of questions, but my basic argument in my book is that expanding nuclear power production is neither a desirable nor a feasible solution to climate change. It's not desirable because expanding nuclear energy to mitigate climate change will inevitably result in a variety of undesirable risks and environmental impacts, some of which I think we're going to talk about. I'll just briefly say the main risk, which many people are aware of, is that all nuclear reactors, including small ones, are vulnerable to severe accidents due to their essential technological characteristics. And the environmental impact that we will talk a little bit more about later is radioactive waste, and we know how bad it is. And finally, if nuclear power were to expand into multiple countries, as its proponents claim, then many countries that are currently without the requisite capabilities will acquire some of the technical means to make nuclear weapons. Which ones will actually go on to building nuclear weapons will depend on political circumstances, but these are always changing. Okay, so when you make this kind of an argument, a lot of people would say, yes, we know these risks, but the threat from climate change is so grave that we need to bear these risks and go ahead with expanding nuclear power. But that argument offered by nuclear advocates really does not make sense, because expanding nuclear energy is not a feasible way to deal with climate change. For one, nuclear power is a very expensive source of generating electricity. And so money that you're spending on that would buy you a lot more of renewables, which have become the cheapest way of generating power today. And secondly, a nuclear reactor takes a long time to build, about a decade. And there's a long period, maybe about another decade, with all the planning processes that have to be gone through. And so if British Columbia, for example, which does not have any nuclear plants right now, were to embark on nuclear power plant construction, it would be the 2040s before the first unit of electricity would flow into the grids here. And that's too late from the climate clock perspective. And the final thing I would say is that the reason why organizations that are many organizations that are supporting nuclear power are also deeply invested in fossil fuels. If you look at utility companies in the US, all the ones that own nuclear power plants are also owning large natural gas or coal interests. And because nuclear plants are so expensive that only the most richest of these utility companies with market capitalizations in the tens and tens of billions of dollars will own them. And you don't get there without owning fossil fuel interests. So they are not really interested in rapid climate action. And so I think actually trying to invest in nuclear power will slow down the switch from fossil fuels for also political reasons as opposed to technical reasons. So all these reasons why I think nuclear power cannot be a solution to climate change.
Thanks, Ramana. Leona or Joshua, do you want to add to that?
Sure.
Give us your version.
I'm gonna try really hard to do a 2-minute elevator pitch. So everything Ramana said, yes, yes, yes. If I was talking to someone about climate or why nuclear is not, why is it a false solution, I would basically, if I had my chance, especially someone in power, to let them know the carbon footprint of nuclear is only counted at the power plant. So by erasing all of the carbon and all of the processes before the power plant and the forever toxic waste afterward, the industry, the governments, and everybody who doesn't see the actual true cost of all of the carbon and fossil fuels that goes into it at the front end, that's one thing. It needs to be included. But by erasing the front end, they're erasing the human rights of all of the people living at all of those facilities along the way. Because if we're not counted, then we're expendable. Essentially, they are sacrificing us, and we are not a sacrifice zone. We do not want to be sacrificed. So essentially, nuclear kills, and nuclear is killing my people. Nuclear is what we call a slow genocide. So just because we can't see it, it's out of sight, out of mind, doesn't mean it's not happening. And if you need proof of it, come visit us, come see any abandoned uranium mine anywhere in the world. On Navajo, we have over 2,000. There's over 20,000 in the United States. And so that's where we need to begin. It doesn't matter if it goes to energy or weapons. Everyone at the front end is just as impacted. And we are suffering for the rest of the world, various cancers, genetic issues. So essentially, it's our future. They're stealing our future. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Leona. Joshua, do you want to give us your elevator pitch?
It's hard to go after two great answers. I talk to a lot of people that are in the climate justice movement, the climate and the environmental movement in general, and many of them, especially the younger generation, I think, is far enough removed from the successes of the anti-nuke movement in the previous decades, and they're even far enough removed from the tragedy of Fukushima and Chernobyl. And now they kind of believe this rhetoric that's coming out about, oh, it's safe, it's going to be efficient, it's not like all these old plants, it's much overall, it's climate neutral. So why aren't we moving forward with this? We can just roll these out and it's going to be a great success. Well, as Ramana pointed out, this isn't going to happen in time. I mean, there's no, we'll talk about small modular reactors, I'm sure, a little bit. There's never been a small modular reactor that's gone online commercially in this country, even though they've actually been in development, back since the Manhattan Project. So it's not going to happen. It's too expensive. There's other solutions. And I think the one thing I'll just add that is really an important dynamic and something that is often not talked about is consumption. And we will talk about AI and how Amazon and Google are looking to promote atomic energy to power their AI facilities. Well, AI is only promoted as this sort of like capitalist, it's going to better our lives. But really, we shouldn't be talking about expanding energy. We need to be decreasing our energy consumption. And so AI is obviously not doing that. And so I think that's a really, really big big problem. And it's not enough a part of the conversation when we're talking about growth in this capitalist society we live in.
Thank you, Joshua. I'm going to move us along. Another question that we got has to do with one of the investors in the X Energy Amazon project to build new small modular nuclear reactors at Hanford had a quote in their news release saying that nuclear is an important source of clean and reliable power that our nation needs to meet the growing demand for energy. So should nuclear energy be considered clean energy? And what about reliability? Leona, do you want to take this one first?
I'll let the others take the reliability part, but yeah, nuclear is one of the most toxic, dirtiest forms of creating, well, it's the most expensive, complicated, dirtiest way to boil water. And as I said previously, we're talking about water on the Navajo Nation and in the desert Southwest. We are dealing with a lot of issues regarding our water rights. We're seeing changes in climate that are impacting our culture, our various practices. Since time immemorial, there's Indigenous people who there's things that we have to change because of the impacts from climate. And so nuclear using an inordinate amount of water, we say water is life. And so we need to stop giving life to nuclear, because we are dealing with in this country, when you look at, let's say, a nuclear power plant, we have the decommissioning fund. And there's, that's supposed to be somewhat of a remediation or cleanup, but it's there, it's established. When you look at abandoned uranium mines, any of the mines that were established before the EPA, there's over 600,000 abandoned mines of any kind all over the country. And a lot of people aren't aware of this if there's no fence, if there's no sign. And so we have yet to calculate the true cost. We have not even characterized all of the contamination left from past mines, mills, and all of the underground plumes of water. So right now in Navajo Nation, this is one of the only places that's getting cleanup of abandoned uranium mines. So there's no funding in the United States to clean up abandoned uranium mines. Again, mines that started before the EPA, which was most of them because the uranium boom was from the 50s to the early 80s. And so all of these mines are just left blowing around radioactive things and then getting into our water systems. But at the same time, we're not just talking about our environment. We are talking to the human impact and the human cost. Just this year, Congress it was really Speaker Johnson who let RECA lapse. So RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, was one small piece of type of, I wouldn't even call it justice, but yeah, it was a partial justice for people that were hurt by the nuclear industry. And this was for humans. The RECA movement, they're demanding that RECA be continued. And if you don't know what RECA is, I definitely implore you to look it up, get involved, write a letter to Speaker Johnson and tell him to schedule RECA for a vote, because this is a law that was to provide funding for healthcare for people who suffered. And so there is no funding for this anymore. Yet we're putting trillions into new nuclear energy and weapons development. So yes, it is definitely not clean, but we're not just talking about our land and waters. We're talking about our genetic health and that of our future generations.
Thanks, Leona. Ramana or Joshua, you want to talk about clean? Should nuclear be considered clean or reliable?
I'll just pop in.
The reliability part, but Joshua, why don't you talk more about the clean part, and then I can.
Well, I was just going to talk really quickly about just this idea of reliability too. Just a few summers ago, when there was this massive heat wave in France, for example, and France is largely powered by atomic energy, they actually had to take about half of their plants offline because the water that they were drawing from the local rivers were actually low. Those rivers were low because of what? Climate change. So this answer to climate change actually can't operate, at the way that it needs to be operated because of climate change, because the rivers are low. So I find that to be sort of this oxymoron, and also just a reality. All right. The small modular reactors that are proposed along the Columbia River could one day be impacted the same way. Who's to say that we're not going to experience massive drought? Anybody that lives in the Pacific Northwest has seen the climate change very directly in the amount of rainfall that's been happening in the past few years. So predicting that into the future is nearly impossible.
Great. Yeah, I'll just sort of add to that to say, I think Joshua is absolutely right. Climate and weather-related factors are impacting operations at nuclear power plants. And one academic study found that interruptions of these plants have become 7 times more frequent in the decade from 2010 to 2020 as compared to the previous decades. So that's a trend that is only going to become worse in the future. Also about France, the French nuclear fleet in recent years has been quite unreliable. So in 2019, the average French nuclear plant was shut down for 96.2 days out of the year, right? That increased to 115.4 in 2020, 103.8 in 2021, and 152 in 2022. Why? Because the fleet had some generic problems having to do with certain kinds of technical challenges. And because they were all identical or nearly identical reactors, they had to be shut down, okay? Now, what is the question about reliability? So the thing about reliability to remember is that a grid is what we want to be reliable. You want the electricity to come on when you switch on the light, and that's not a property of any individual power plant. All power plants have to be shut down at some point or the other. In some cases, it's for fueling or refueling or for maintenance. And in other cases, like in wind and solar energy, because the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. But the way that a grid tries to deal with it is to have multiple sources of power, and together they try to compensate for one another. And there is no reason, there's a whole set of studies showing that we can run a grid reliably with very high proportions of renewable energy, maybe even as high as 100%.
Thank you. I'm going to move us along to the next question here. So this has to do with here in Oregon, since 1980, we've had a moratorium on new nuclear reactors being built until there's a permanent national waste repository and a vote of the people to overturn the moratorium. As I mentioned earlier, the Umatilla County Board of Commissioners just allocated funds to a lobbying group to try to overturn this law in the Oregon legislature next session. So let's talk about nuclear waste. Do these new advanced or small modular designs address the waste problem? Without a national repository, where would waste from any new nuclear power plants go? And Joshua, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. That's a really important question. And having researched and wrote a book about Hanford, which is, for those that don't know, it houses the most high-level radioactive waste in the country. There's 56 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste in 177 tanks out there. 3 of those tanks right now are leaking into the groundwater supply that will feed the Columbia River. So, the idea of this radioactive waste isn't a problem. We don't have to worry about creating more of it with creating more, building more plants. It's mind-boggling to me. In Oregon, along the Columbia, this company, NuScale, one of the issues for them was, okay, where are we going to put this waste? Where are we going to site this waste? Well, let's just truck it down or put it on a train or maybe even a barge down the Columbia River and put it into these dry casks that exist right now where the Trojan facility was in Oregon. The waste that was produced during the Trojan was up and running, I think was somewhere around 380 tons of high-level waste out there. So we're going to create this new waste, put it in these dry casks, which is really not a permanent solution. I mean, this stuff is radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. And for those in the Pacific Northwest, you live in a subduction zone. There's going to one day be a big earthquake. It could be massive. It could be moderate. They may say that these tanks are safe and can withstand in some kind of quake. Well, they said the same thing about Fukushima, that it was going to be safe if it got hit by a tsunami. It wasn't, obviously. So where are we going to put this waste? But let's broaden that to the United States more generally. If they're going to roll out hundreds of these small modular reactors all over the country, and let's just for a minute pretend that all of the things that we know to be true are not true, for a second, just to play this hypothetical game. Uranium mining doesn't impact indigenous lands. There's never going to be an accident ever. They're totally safe. You still have you have to put this waste somewhere. So let's pretend it's Yucca Mountain. And let's pretend that there's facilities up and down the East Coast and on the West Coast. You're going to have to put this high level waste on rail car, on trucks. You're going to have to transport it hundreds of miles, thousands of miles in some case, to Yucca Mountain. And it's going to go through communities. It's going to go through places that don't want anything to do with this waste. I mean, and Ramana can talk about this happening right now in British Columbia. There's debate about this. So those risks are astronomical. And as we know, we do this with oil now and other chemicals. And I just looked it up this morning. And since 1970, we've had 150 accidents that included oil or chemical waste. Now imagine if that was radioactive waste. It's a really scary proposition, and I'm really frightened about the prospects of creating more of this stuff when we don't have a place to store it currently. And even if we did, as Ramana and Leona can talk about, that itself doesn't mean that it's actually safe for the lifespan of this stuff.
Great. I'm going to move to the next question if you all are okay with that.
Well,
so the next question. Oh,
I would like to add to that.
Sure.
So in Mexico and Texas, we just defeated 2 consolidated interim storage facilities. In New Mexico, I would say we defeated Holtec. We stopped Holtec from building the world's largest radioactive waste dump, but CIS, consolidated interim storage, is illegal under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And right now, there's a move to change that. Our victory, we as community people, because of the transport, like Josh just spoke about, the Navajo Nation has passed a law against transport in 2012. And this would include that type of waste going on our rails through our homelands. And so we did get successfully a state law to prohibit this type of facility in New Mexico and Texas, only for the NRC to give licenses to both the Texas project and the New Mexico project. So right now, we're winning right now, but this is going to be taken up by the Supreme Court, and we will hear something by June of next year. So what we are saying out here is we don't, if there's a temporary facility, it's going to become de facto permanent because there are no permanent facilities. But the reality is there is a mill in Southeast Utah called the White Mesa Mill. And because it has a license to process uranium ore and alternate feed, it is acting as an ad hoc nuclear waste dump for any type of nuclear materials that it can accept, even coming from Japan and all of these other facilities, which is becoming essentially just this nuclear waste dump in the middle of the desert. So that's what's happening because there are not enough licensed facilities and people pushing for safe containment. I mean, the thing is, we have to stop making the waste. That's what we got to do. Thanks.
Thank you. So our next question is, a lot of these nuclear plants are ostensibly to address the huge energy use of data centers and AI technology. So what about the economics of data centers makes them more prone to wanting to link up with nuclear power plants? Is this just a way for tech giants to look like they'll be addressing the greenhouse gas emissions in the future through nuclear while continuing to rely on fracked gas? Ramana, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So I'd like to back up and say the projecting sort of future demand growth and shortages of energy is a standard practice for the nuclear industry. They've always done that. They did that in the case of South Carolina and Georgia when they were building the nuclear reactors. The UK said the same thing when they started building Hinkley Point. And this goes back to the dawn of the nuclear age, right? Now, when it comes to companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, the public has plenty of reason to be angry about them, right? They steal your data, they do all kinds of bad things. And so these companies want to pretend to be good citizens. And the reason they can use investment in nuclear energy as a way to pretend that they are good citizens is because the hard work of convincing the public about the great virtues of nuclear technology has already been done by the nuclear lobby, right? In the last few decades, we've seen them embark on a largely successful, unfortunately successful PR campaign to brand nuclear energy as a clean technology, it's safe, and so on. As my co-panelists have elaborately and explained, it's by no means clean. But these facts, unfortunately, can be hidden by when you throw millions and millions of dollars worth of propaganda at people. And because it has been painted with this brush about being clean and a solution to climate change, all these announcements about nuclear power serve as a kind of flashy distraction to focus public attention on, while these companies are actually increasing emissions from coal and natural gas plants and fracking and so on and so forth. And this is like the magician strategy. You do something here, people are looking there, where you're actually doing something else with your other hand. And that's really the strategy that I can see. And also, I'll just add one more thing. I mean, we can go on in this long thing, but I'll just add one more thing. I think all these companies also learned from an earlier round of hype that we just saw about use of nuclear power, and that was from the cryptocurrency industry, right? A few years ago, we saw a whole bunch of these cryptocurrency companies getting bad publicity because they were using so much energy for these completely pointless computations. And how people were comparing how much they were using with other countries and so on. And this was not good publicity. So then some of them said, oh, we are going to enter into agreements with nuclear power suppliers. And that's exactly the strategy that Amazon and Google and so on have done. And the last thing I'll say is that we don't really know what's actually in these contracts, right? We only have seen announcements. Now, I fully expect that Amazon and Google and so on have smart lawyers who would have put all kinds of conditionalities there, right? The plant should be registered, licensed, it should be built in this thing, this will be the cost. We don't get to hear about any of that because neither side wants to actually us to know anything of that sort. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. At Columbia Riverkeeper, we talk a lot about a just transition for the Columbia River. And I'm wondering if you see, is there a way that new nuclear power could fit into a just transition model, or is it really just another form of nuclear colonialism? What are the questions frontline communities should be asking about the impacts of new nuclear power on their communities? Leona, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, I think what Josh said earlier, I don't believe there is a such thing as a just transition. What people might imagine, we're transitioning from one form of energy to continue our level of consumption from another form of energy. That's not going to happen. In order to provide energy for everyone, we need to reduce our consumption. Right now, the Navajo Nation alone, a lot of us consider our colonial government as a resource colony, that coal, oil, uranium, all these things are being taken out only to fuel the outside world. But if we looked at the actual consumption of electricity by Diné people, many who don't have electricity in their homes and running water, if the rest of the world, I mean, we've been here for millennia, we can survive without. This is why we are here as Indigenous peoples. If the rest of the world could reduce their consumption, and it's not going to happen by choice, it needs to be policy that we need to, as humans, we need to reduce the consumption and consider renewables and other forms of energy where there is no trade-off. Human life is not a trade-off.
Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about Hanford here. So the question is, why not site new nuclear at Hanford, which is the country's largest nuclear cleanup site? There's already a workforce there that understands nuclear issues, and in many ways, Hanford has already been treated as a sacrifice zone. So why not site new reactors there? Joshua, do you want to take that one?
Well, first I'd say I'm a proponent of ending sacrifice zones, not creating more sacrifice zones. Hanford is still a mess. I mean, maybe proponents of citing more waste there would say, well, let's put it there. It's already a mess. I would say, we haven't cleaned up the mess that our atomic weapons industry created out there in the first place. So no one can come and say we should make more of this stuff and increase the chances of a future, a risk out there. And there's just so many problems with proposing this. I mean, we're looking at Hanford. The cleanup itself right now is somewhere around $700 billion. I would estimate by the end of the decade, it's going to reach $1 trillion. These tanks that have this high level radioactive waste, they've done ribbon cutting ceremonies to start this little test reactor would turn this waste into glass. It overheated. I mean, there's so much money pouring into this thing. I don't trust those that say that it can be done in a way that doesn't create more problems when they haven't been able to fix the problems that it's already been created. And yes, there is some differences between energy waste and weapons waste, although when it comes to the environment, some of the impacts are very much the same. So that's the first thing I would say. And lastly, I would say, going back to AI, because that's essentially why they want to build these plants out there, is to power AI. This last year, we saw almost a doubling, according to the International Energy Agency, of energy used by AI. It was somewhere around, I think I have it written down here, like 460 terawatt hours. It jumped to about 1,000. To put that in perspective, Europe consumed 2,700 terawatt hours last year. So these companies are wanting to say, oh, we're going green and we're going to roll out nuclear, we're going to do this and that, without addressing the underlying issue, which is that they're creating a bunch more need for energy production when we should be reducing that need and transitioning what we already are using from fossil fuels to real renewables. And the answers are already there. Not only do we need to reduce our use of energy, we need to be doing so in a way that impacts people much, much less. And of course, we can get into lithium, we can get into all kinds of other issues as well. But I don't think any of them pose the same risks long-term as nuclear power does and nuclear energy.
And just to add real quick, a lot of the use of our computer networks, requires a lot of water to keep the servers cool. So, I mean, I'm just scared the question is going to be flipped. Is nuclear energy being created to power AI, or is AI being created to regulate and run nuclear? But yeah, the water consumption is, again, my concern with all of it.
Thank you. So let's talk about the costs of these new proposed nuclear power plants. The idea behind small modulars is that there would be cost savings because the parts would be mass produced in factories and shipped to their locations. However, projects like NuScale's plan to build small modular reactors in Idaho was canceled as the cost more than doubled. And the 2 new reactors built recently in Georgia were also more than double the original cost. And this is at the same time that wind and solar are coming, the costs are coming down. It's becoming more and more economical than nuclear. So how does nuclear ever pencil out? Ramana, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Simple answer is it doesn't. There's no question about that. All the evidence will show that the best small modular reactors can do, even in the most optimistic scenarios, is they would become cost comparable to large reactors. And large reactors, we have seen, are not economical, right? And the reason why small modular reactors are going to be even more expensive per unit of power generated or electricity generated or power generation capacity is that when you go to a smaller reactor, you're losing out on what are called economies of scale, that the amount of material that you need, the number of workers you need, and so on, do not scale in proportion, in a linear proportion with the amount of power that you generate. So when you go to smaller, it's actually going to become more expensive. So the only way that any of these projects are going to go forward is if there's going to be the risks and the costs are going to be socialized to the public. And these companies are going to, of course, get all their private profits.
Okay, so the next question, in recent months, we've noticed that Amazon Web Services and Google are starting to pay to be sponsors of conferences put on by nonprofit organizations that work on clean energy and climate issues here in the Pacific Northwest. It seems to me like these tech giants are kind of worming their way into movement spaces for their own corporate benefits. So what will it take for climate activists and philanthropic interests that support climate-focused organizations to engage in opposing new nuclear power as a threat to addressing climate change versus some that currently support or are open to supporting pro-nuclear organizations or believe that nuclear power could be a solution? Leona, do you want to go first?
I have the same question. For years and years, I've been asking big NGOs, let's say in New Mexico, the big victory we had over Holtec was because the Sierra Club actually got engaged in the fight. We had tried 4 times for over the course of 7 years to pass these laws to prohibit these facilities. And the year that Sierra Club actually put some funding, some staff time into it, it was a piece of cake. It was no problem because they are they are an operating machine and they have, all their cogs moving within the system, that if all of the NGOs did not submit to the nonprofit industrial complex and actually put funding into fighting nuclear, we wouldn't have this problem. And so we need all of our friends and allies and other people, even going across the aisle, getting other political parties to really look at this issue and to educate them. I think one of the things is a lot of folks are still really in the dark about nuclear. It's an invisible monster. And so I think that's one of the issues that is really plaguing the fight and the movement, is that it's funding driven. But if you're living in a place where you're breathing in radioactive dust and there's underground plumes of radioactive water that you don't know if you're drinking from, it's a life or death situation. You really don't have an option to be pro-nuclear. And as Indigenous peoples, folks might say, well, why don't you move? No, we don't move. We don't have that option, and we are not going to be a sacrifice zone. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to read one more question here. We've got a ton of questions coming in from folks today, and we're just unfortunately not going to have time to answer them. But I think this can lead to future webinars and future reports and future ways of having these discussions. So I'm going to read one last question for our panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of them for some closing remarks before we end this today. So the last question we'll have time for is, some of these new nuclear designs, including the X-energy model that's proposed at Hanford, rely on a type of fuel called HALEU that's enriched to a level that makes it more of a danger for nuclear weapons proliferation than some of the old-style light water reactors, such as the Columbia Generating Station at Hanford. Also, the war in Ukraine has exposed how nuclear reactors themselves can be used as weapons in war. So what are the linkages between nuclear weapons and nuclear power? Is it possible to have one without the other? Ramana, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Again, the answer is no, you can't have one without the other. There are 5 kinds of connections that I talk about in my book. There is a connection of history, the reactors at Hanford, for example, were the first reactors ever built, and they were built to produce plutonium for the bomb that was tested in New Mexico first and then dropped on Nagasaki. Then there's a kind of geographical overlap. If you look at the nuclear power plants around the world, the bulk of them are in countries with nuclear weapons. And if you include countries like Canada and Japan, which are in military alliances with these nuclear weapon states, then that overlap becomes overwhelming. There's an overlap in sort of basic technology. People who get trained to operate and design nuclear power plants also get some training to try and make nuclear weapons. There's a question of institutions and of personnel. Institutions, I think, are more important because in most countries with nuclear weapons, it's the same institution that's operating both the nuclear weapons and the nuclear energy. In the US, it is the Department of Energy. But what is also interesting is that historically, the nuclear energy industry has tried to distance itself from nuclear weapons ever since Atoms for Peace under Eisenhower, except when they are in financial distress. So, for example, when the Trump administration came to power, they could not pretend that they are interested in climate change, or that is the reason why the Trump administration should support them. So they went around and they said, well, this is actually great for national security, because there are people who are working in the nuclear submarines in the nuclear navy. When they retire, they can come and work in nuclear power plants, et cetera, et cetera. So they produce these bunch of reports, basically making that argument. So one just has to look at what they themselves put out to show that these two things are related.
Thank you. So we're going to go to closing remarks. Each panelist has about 3 minutes. If there's anything you wanted to say today that you didn't get to say, or anything you want to emphasize, now's your chance. So we'll start with Leona.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot more of a discussion. Some things we didn't get to is, Biden pushing, I mean, that's why we're having this webinar, the tripling of nuclear power by 2050. That's something the US is trying to lead the world in creating more nuclear, which again creates more radioactive waste and continues this silent, long, slow genocide. And so folks that are not aware of this, I would say, going back to the NGOs, if folks are not speaking out against it, not only are they, complicit, if they're actually proponents of nuclear, they're promoting this type of genocide among our people. If the world can use the Navajo Nation as an example and look at what's happening in Africa, they're trying to, restart Coburg. And then there's also a move to build a nuclear power plant in Kenya. All of those, the environment is similar, where we can say, we've already seen this happen, and we don't, the definition of insanity, why would we repeat the same problems? But yeah, I just wanted to end by saying that I'm working with a group, and we have this campaign called Haul No. So this is specifically on the transport of uranium from the Grand Canyon to the White Mesa Mill. And this is a huge fight, and we need everyone's support to help to shut down the Pinyon Plain uranium mine. So we're asking folks to write letters to the governor of Arizona. But there's an even bigger fight, which, looking at the United Nations convening of parties, the COP that's coming up in November. And so I'd like to invite folks to a webinar on October 30th. NEARS is going to be hosting a webinar. Haul No will be hosting another webinar on November 6th regarding the transport and the Navajo Nation laws, the prohibition of uranium mining and transport on Navajo Nation, those laws of which are being changed and updated because of this mine that just recently started to transport through our lands. So yeah, I would just like to emphasize, folks can visit our website, follow us, Haul No. And that's, that's our response to the nuclear industry. Do we want more nuclear? Do we want more radioactive water? Haul No.
Thanks, Leona. And we'll be sure to have a link to Haul No and to these upcoming webinars in the email that goes out to everyone after this. Joshua, do you want to give some closing remarks?
Sure. I mean, we could talk about these issues all afternoon, and maybe one day we will. I really do think they're that important. We tend to think about nuclear issues as something of the past, although now it's being resurrected again. But a lot of the impacts from the past still exist today. And I would just beckon any environmental activist, anybody that's concerned about the climate, to listen to people like Leona, to talk to Indigenous peoples that have been impacted by this, talk about the victims of nuclear colonialism, because that to me is the beating heart of this movement against atomic energy and proliferation in general. And one last thing I would add is we live in a world of turmoil, right? With what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Ukraine. And in Ukraine in particular, Zaporizhzhia is at very, very great risk of melting down. These plants, these facilities, whether they're storing waste or operating, remain a target. We've never experienced this before. So we roll out thousands of these new plants. Who's to say what's going to happen conflict-wise into the future? I mean, right now, Taiwan, which is scaling down their atomic energy programs, those tanks that still exist there could be a target if there's a conflict that erupts there. The dangers are almost exponential, and I really want to caution people when we're talking about these answers to climate change to analyze and accept and look at the externalities that come along with them, and with whatever that transitional fuel or energy source may be.
Thanks, Joshua. Ramana, go for it.
Yeah, there's again a lot to say. I'll just say two brief things or touch on 2 points. One is to follow up on the discussion about these AI companies and to link it to the question about the relationship between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. One must remember that one of the largest clients and a major funder for these AI and cloud companies is the Pentagon and the military, right? And the trend is becoming more prominent in recent years. The Pentagon and military have really sort of adopted AI. Tech companies have turned Ukraine into an AI war lab, according to Time magazine. Israel is using AI to generate and justify targets in Gaza, thus speeding up the ongoing genocide there. And so all of these things show that there's a very tight linkage between AI and the national security military complex. And they love nuclear energy. It's the same institution ultimately. So it's not surprising that these companies are saying, oh, let's also invest in nuclear power, because it just makes them more attractive to the Pentagon. The other thing I want to say is there's another player here which hasn't been mentioned, which has been also has been changing a lot, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the NRC has to license all these new reactors or allow the restart of old reactors like Palisades, like TMI, and so on. And the NRC has become a textbook case of regulatory capture, had become already, and is becoming worse by the day, right? Congress is really pushing hard on them to say, you guys need to speed up your thing. You're being an impediment to innovation and, American whatever, sales and things of that sort. And NRC isn't really, is sort of complying. And that's one place where I think public pressure would also be useful.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to start wrapping things up here. I just want to thank our wonderful panelists for being here today. I know I learned a lot. There was a lot of food for thought. I think this is the, one piece in a discussion. Obviously, there's more webinars that Leona mentioned that are coming up. There'll be other ways to engage. I do want to plug a couple books. We have Joshua Frank's book here. This is a great resource looking at the Atomic Days, the Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America, that looks at Hanford and the linkages that you heard Josh talk about here today. We also have Ramana's new book. Oh, look at that. We have 2 copies. Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. This book, you may have noticed when you registered for the webinar, the first 20 folks who registered for this webinar will be getting a free PDF of this book for your reading pleasure. And additionally, 20 people who are here today will also be getting it. So we're giving away, thanks to a generous donor, 40 copies of Ramana's book. So with the money that you save from Ramana's book, you can buy Josh's book and you can make a donation to Hall No. So that's your next steps after this webinar. I want to appreciate that we did have a lot of questions that we just couldn't get to today. And we're saving those questions, and we'll see how we might be able to follow up with the follow-up email, but we are going to have resources in that email for you all to look at. So with that, I think we will close it out, and thank you all so much for being part of the discussion today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.